and it had been a resounding success. But he was still a Mongol at heart, and he craved new conquests. Most of the kingdoms of Asia paid tribute to Kublai in order to maintain some level of self-control. They knew there was little point in opposing the massive war machine of the Mongols. But Kublai still felt there was one thorn in his side: Japan. He had sent many requests that Japan accept him as their emperor, but every offer was met with the execution of his envoys. It was the challenge Kublai had been hoping for. He enlisted the reluctant Koreans to crew the sunk ships he had captured and mounted his first invasion of Japan in 1274. An army of 20,000 cavalry and infantry reached the offshore island of Iki and overcame the Japanese forces there. But as the day wore on, the weather began to change, and when a storm broke, the fleet was caught in its full fury and was destroyed. But Kublai wasn't to be deterred by this setback. The reports he'd received from the first attack showed that the Mongol forces were superior in every way. They had simply been the victims of bad luck. So a second invasion was launched in 1281 with a two-pronged attack from North and South China. The commanders were to meet on the island of Iki and then converge at the center of Hakata Bay. But the Japanese were better prepared than the first time, and Kublai's forces met with fierce resistance. Fighting went on with little progress for 2 months. Then disaster. Another typhoon struck and slammed the Mongol boats against the rocks. Almost all were lost. The Mongol forces trapped on shore watched in horror as their only chance of escape sunk. The elated Japanese forces quickly overran them. But even then, Kublai didn't want to give up.
Very stubbornly, after this terrible defeat, which was extremely costly in terms of men and equipment, of course, and financially, he was determined to have another go against Japan. But fortunately, on this occasion, he was just so completely put off it by the advisors and the other military people in the government that it was called off. But I think that shows that maybe his judgment wasn't so good, and it shows that perhaps he was rather anxious to fulfill the ideal image of a great Mongol ruler still, which is very much of the conquering hero, the conquering military chief. And of course they were running out of neighbours to conquer.
But after this second defeat and the advice he was given, Kublai decided to abandon his military campaigns, and he began to get more and more involved in the decadent pleasures of court life. On feast days, 6,000 people could be fed in a single sitting at his palace in Tartu. But then, in 1281, tragedy struck. His beloved Chabi died, followed 4 years later by his son and heir, Chenchin. It was more than Kublai could bear. He was grief-stricken and never recovered from his loss.
And it's notable, in fact, that his rule began to decline in many ways in the last decade or so of his life after Chabi died, and he became, from reports that we have of the time, somewhat morose, inclined to drink very heavily. He ate too much and became very obese, and in some senses seemed to almost lose interest in being that kind of very fulfilled, very active ruler that he had been when he had that favorite wife at his side.
But by this time, he hadn't only lost his wife. The trusted advisors that he had gathered around him long ago had also died of old age. A new generation of Chinese and Muslim advisors were in court and had become corrupted by their power. But Kublai was increasingly preoccupied with pleasure, leaving the bulk of minor decisions to his court. Kublai's final years were spent in isolation. Increasingly, he consoled himself with alcohol and food, and he became fat and ill with gout. By 1294, Kublai had withdrawn from public life and lost his enthusiasm for the celebrations he once adored. the court at Tartu, once a place of merriment and excitement, became gloomy and depressed. In February, when he was in his 80th year, old age and over-excess finally got the better of him. The great Kublai Khan died alone in his palace. Kublai's great hope had been that the lands he won would stay in Mongol hands forever. But this was not to be. Chinese rebels rose up and reclaimed their nation. The once mighty Mongols fled Tartu, and the Ming dynasty was born. The Mongols were assimilated into the new dynasty, and their star began to fade from Asia. But this doesn't detract from Kublai's achievements. To understand the scale of what he accomplished, we have to appreciate where he had come from.
He came from a nomadic, warlike people, the Mongols, who had never known a very settled kind of society, and managed to convert himself into the emperor of one of the greatest sedentary civilizations, Chinese civilization, that the world has ever seen. And he did so in a tolerant and cooperative way, rather than through sheer brute force, which is what we might have expected from his own background.
From the days of his grandfather, Genghis, Mongol hordes had struck fear and terror into hearts and minds throughout Asia. But Kublai Khan challenged this stereotype. Tempering tyranny with tolerance, his regime brought a more civilized form of rule. This dynamic and forward-thinking leader turned his back on many Mongol traditions and showed that Mongols were more than savages or barbarians. Yet throughout his reign, Kublai never forgot his heritage. He remained a Mongol, and like other Mongol leaders, he embarked upon numerous military campaigns. His conquest of southern Sung China was a stunning victory. It was one that his warlike predecessors had never been able to achieve, and it ensured his status as a great Mongol commander. And the fact that China is still unified today is a direct consequence of Kublai's vision of completing what his forefathers had begun.